Hello everyone, my name is Nick Hopwood. This is a podcast based on Andrew Shenton's 2004 article, Strategies for Ensuring Trustworthiness in Qualitative Research Projects. You might be listening to this as one of the students in the UTS Research Perspectives or Research Design subjects or another subject, or you might have come across this through my blog or other sources. I'm going to raise 20 points. It sounds like a lot, but hopefully I'll get through them relatively quickly. It's really handy, I think, to have read the paper first and to have it with you as you're listening to this podcast. So I would very much recommend that you have either a digital or a paper copy to hand as you go and listen to this and have read it at least once. Okay, so here we go. This paper is about ensuring trustworthiness in qualitative research. It's a really nice paper and I think it makes a lot of very useful arguments. The first thing I would say, and this will be what I come back to in my 20th point, is that there is more to quality in research and in qualitative research than trustworthiness. And I'll raise that at the end. Trustworthiness is important, but there are other things that make our research good or that are important if we want to do our research well. Those of you who know me will know that a big thing I keep arguing is that good research is more than technically competent. We have to add something else into the mix. Okay, so let's look at the introduction, which is on page 63 there. Now, Shenton has said that many qualitative researchers or naturalistic investigators prefer to use different terminology to distance themselves from a positivist paradigm. The general point here is that what quality or trustworthiness looks like and how you will explain and justify that depends on the kind of research you're doing. And in a sense, that's a really good thing because it means partly you get to set the goalposts yourself. You get to say, this is what doing my research well would mean. Now, obviously, we have to do that. We can't just make that up. We have to do that within the context of a broader systematic assessment of what good research looks like. And this is one example of that this paper provides. Point number 3 comes up on page 64 under credibility, and it's how congruent are the findings with reality. That's a really interesting point. Now, you may, in qualitative research, be wanting to change reality. You might not want to be just mirroring reality with knowledge, but also wanting to change it. But I don't want to pick at the wording here too much. It's a really important point that's equivalent to the idea of internal validity, which is in any research, we want to make sure that what we're claiming about bears the right kind of relationship with the external phenomenon under investigation. Now, the first point under 2 is A, the adoption of research methods that are well established. Basically, the point here is build on approaches with a proven track record. And I think that's a really, really good point. Some methods are used very widely for good reason because we know they work very well. Now, it doesn't mean that just because a method is an established one, that it's the right one for your study. And there may be other established methods that are better. It doesn't excuse you from that really important thinking. But it does mean that perhaps we have to be cautious or very well justified if we want to go and completely innovate and try something new. It may be that you're interested to try a proven methodology, but in a slightly different context. And in whatever the case, piloting is crucial. If you've piloted and tested something out to see if it gives you the kind of data you need, that's the strongest possible argument or basis for making design decisions, I think. My 5th point comes under B, which is on page 65. Early familiarity with the culture of participating organisations or whatever the context of your research is. And I think that's an interesting point. I'm not going to give a clear answer here, but it's a question, do you know enough about the context in order to be able to understand it and make appropriate claims or contributions to knowledge? Now, there might be value in ignorance. I've done some research where I knew very little about the context, and in fact that was what made me able to see it differently from the people involved. I am very much in favour of prolonged engagement in terms of ethnography. Perhaps if we know too much, we become an insider, or we already are an insider, and it's hard to see things any differently. But the question is certainly an important one. On point C, on page 64, which is my 6th point, is to do with random sampling. And I'm just going to leave the question out that randomness may not always be best, or even possible. And there's very little value in methodological rules which prove to be impractical. This argument in Shenton's paper says towards that random sampling gives you representation. You may not want representativeness, and even if you try and sample people randomly, there may still be a non-random response bias, meaning that the people who don't choose to participate have a particular quality about them. So randomness doesn't guarantee representativeness, and it depends on who decides to participate, and we may not always want representativeness. Under point D, or my 7th point, is to do with triangulation. And this is where I think perhaps I might disagree a bit with some of the things that Shenton and others have said. Triangulation builds on a metaphor or a process used in shipping navigation and other forms of navigation, where you look at the same object from 3 different angles and you're able to fix it exactly in space. Now, I'm not sure that that's exactly always what we want to do in qualitative research, that there is a single right view that we have to fix on, either by using the same method with different informants or lots of different methods. In fact, I think different methods often may reveal contradictory or alternative views of things. Triangulation is not the same as multiple methods. You can have multiple methods without triangulation, and you can have triangulation without multiple methods. But I might question the premise of wanting to fix a correct view. And you would need to ask yourself, what if my observations contradicted what people were telling me in interviews? Does that mean people were lying? Does that mean you have to abandon the interviews? Does that mean one of them is right and one of them is wrong? Thinking through what the consequences might be opens up a lot of questions. My 8th point refers to point E on page 66, tactics to help ensure the honesty of informants. And basically here what I think Shenton has really usefully pointed out is that the quality or trustworthiness in our research is not separate from the questions of ethics and how we recruit participants and how we ask them to be involved and what they know about the study. Neither is it separate from the techniques. In other words, the way we do our research. And that can help to produce honesty. But remembering that it may not just be a question of honest versus dishonest. There are all sorts of grey areas. There are things to do with memory, to do with comfort levels, to do with what people think is relevant and what they think you want them to say. All sorts of factors come in there. My 9th point on page 67 is to do with F, iterative questioning. Now, I'm not sure that we're really always about trying to detect falsehoods and resolve contradictions. In my experience, often the same person may contradict themselves, or different people may have what seem like contradictory accounts of the same advice. It doesn't necessarily mean that one of them was lying, deliberately or otherwise. And I think many of us can hold contradictions, and contradictions are a feature of human life. So iterative questioning, asking again and again and probing are very, very useful techniques. I definitely agree with Shenton there, but I'm not sure that it's really going to be boiled down to dismissing what we know to be falsehoods. The negative case analysis, which is perhaps not the most obvious naming for the idea of refining a hypothesis until it covers all the instances of your data, or making sure a typology or your categories code all instances of it. I think it's important to make sure that we test our ideas against all our data. And we want to disprove ourselves often as possible. If we're coming up with an idea or a concept, of course we want to look through our data to say, well, where is it where this might be challenged or changed? But it may be that we can't come up with frameworks or arguments that account for everything. Just as statisticians discount outliers, it may actually weaken a framework if we try and make it account for everything. That we may want to say this accounts for these aspects, but of course acknowledging some things which don't fit within it. Shenton's points to H and I on page 67 make my 11th point, which is don't assume that quality in research or credibility lies with you alone if you're researching on your own. It's also about peer scrutiny and getting other people to feed back on things and look at your data. That quality actually comes from exposing yourself to other people's feedback. Turning over now to page 68, point J, reflective commentary. I think it's very important. But remember, this is not a confession. Okay, and it's very easy to overdo this reflective thing. Unless we're doing autoethnography or kind of research about ourselves, generally readers are reading what you're writing because they want to know about something or somebody else. Now, this is therefore your reflective commentary is on a need-to-know basis, and we'll explore more about what people might need to know. But they don't want to know all the different problems you had or everything about your life history. It's what's relevant in order to helping them trust your case. So it's a need-to-know basis for reflection. This turns over to what is point K on page 68 of my 13th point, which is about the investigator. And I say here is an opportunity to turn subjectivity into a strength. We can acknowledge that all qualitative research is based, in part at least, on craft or art, aesthetic values, and that the techniques in interviewing and observation, or whatever it is that we're doing, have that craftful or artistic dimension to them, and we really need to get good at them. Now, member checking is Shenton's point 2L in my 14th comment. It's very, very common to be promoted in the literature, methods literature. I'm very, very cautious about it for a number of reasons. It may not always make sense for members to check things if you're working with children or very vulnerable people, or people might not be able to read an interview transcript or other things. And perhaps the account you're giving is deliberately one that you wouldn't expect them to recognise because of your theoretical background or what it is that you're trying to say that's different for how people might already understand their situation. It's also worth thinking about what if. What if you say, yes, I'm going to offer you the ability to check the data, and I heard a story of a student who did this. She spent a year observing in an organisation, gave them the data and said, would you like to check this? And they said, actually, now we can see it. We're not going to allow you to use the data. So you have to be cautious. What if you ask somebody to read through their interview transcripts and they say, now I've changed my mind? Well, do you ask them what they've changed their mind to, and then do you get them to check that? Where do you draw the line? How many times do you get them to change their mind? And what does it mean just because they didn't agree with what they said? What if you give people veto over your findings? There's interestingly Steve Woolgar's and Bruno Latour's book on laboratory life. They presented their findings to the scientists involved, and the scientists disagreed. Instead of changing their findings, what they did was publish something at the beginning with the scientists kind of got to say, or they described how the scientists had disagreed with them. Personally, I'm a little bit queasy about the idea of member checking as a universal rule. It's obviously important in some contexts, but there are risks involved with it, and it's certainly not always appropriate. On page 69, M, thick description. This is my 15th point. I think thick description is involving being specific and concrete rather than general and abstract in how you describe the phenomenon, in the evidence you produce or discuss, and in the claims you make. N, examination of previous research findings. This is my 16th point. No research comes from nowhere, even if you have to bridge to other topics. I've been contacted by heaps of students saying there's no literature on my area, I'm looking at some XXXX. Well, maybe there isn't, but there is certainly literature about something else. So let's imagine you're saying, why do people who operate roller coasters leave their jobs? Now, maybe there is no literature on that, but there will be literature on why people leave their jobs, or literature on theme park industries or something like that. Now we're moving on to transferability. Now, my 17th point comes from the first sentence under section 3 on page 69. The extent to which the findings of one study can be applied to other situations. Now, I'm not sure that application is the best word here, in the sense that findings here are also the same over there. I think we might be asking the question of to what extent are the findings meaningful or useful or of benefit to people in other situations. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily the same thing will be happening there, that they apply, but that people in those situations can make some useful sense of them. One of the dangers with going on the kind of a generalizability idea, that this is what applies here, is that all you can generalize or apply is the lowest common denominator. And often what's interesting is not what's universally shared or very widely shared. So this is sustained on page 70 towards the bottom, where they say, in order to assess the extent in which findings may be true of people in other settings. Now, I'm not sure that actually transferability should be reduced to what might be true in other settings. I think we can have a more open view of that. Turning on to page 71 and dependability, my 18th point is perhaps that dependability is less about the idea of reproducing research and getting the same outcome, and more about helping readers know and trust in the processes and origins of what you have to say. And in order to establish that, you do pretty much have to describe aspects of the research in a way that they could feel they could do it again. It's not so they will and we'd expect the same outcome, but it's so they know enough about where what you're saying has come from. So it's about the audit trail, which is also mentioned on page 72. Under confirmability, I'd suggest my 19th point is that this is not about taking all human skill and perception out of it, which is what positivism and objectivity would do, but rather the opposite, as I said before, making subjectivity a strength. But there is a question of making sure that we haven't completely over-determined our research so that the experiences and idea as informants rather than our characteristics or preferences take over. But what about what the researcher brings? Perhaps I bring a theoretical way of understanding things which the informants could never bring themselves. This is one of the reasons why I observe things rather than interview people. So I think it's important to balance the objectivity ideas of this with the ideas that as researchers we do bring unique things, and sometimes it's our uniqueness that means that we can produce something that nobody else can, and that's where its value lies. My final point is to do what's perhaps missing here, and that's not a criticism of the paper, because the paper was about trustworthiness, and I think it explores trustworthiness in a very thorough way. But what is missing is the fact that we could do completely trustworthy research, it could be useless. We could follow all these criteria and meet them and have nothing useful to say. And that's why I think there's more to quality in research than trustworthiness. And Shenton isn't claiming to write about quality, just about trustworthiness. But if we are going to think about, well, what does it mean to do research well, we have to do more than be trustworthy. We have to be more than technically competent. We have to capture people's imagination. We have to say something that grabs their attention. It may not be what they want to hear, but it has to get their attention. It has to excite people, has to engage people, has to have some value, has to change the way we think about things. It may point to social justice. It may help make things more efficient or improve outcomes. But technically competent research does not guarantee that. We have to make sure that we bring that kind of extra factor into our research. Anyway, there's my commentary on Shenton's paper. As I said, I think it's a very useful and very thorough paper. Lots of very good ideas, very clearly laid out. And my comments are often in agreement with Shenton and sometimes taking the ideas into slightly different territory and sometimes politely disagreeing. I hope you found this podcast useful.